Yeah, so I am actually filming this video in order to escape from my actual problems because I have an exam tomorrow. So here's some live footage of my mental health spiraling.
Has changed.
Hey guys, so today I want to cover the material for analysis in chapter 18 of the Dressmaker, and again we'll be framing our comparison around the Crucible. So, a quick summary of chapter 18. We see Tilly slowly opening up to Teddy, and we see the two go to the ball together, but Tilly gets shut out by the townspeople. Tilly and Teddy kind of get down and dirty, but Teddy dies, and there's a lot of material for comparison here. Okay, so at the start of the chapter, we see Tilly watching an upside down beetle, and she drops it onto the grass, so we're meant to see her as inherently good, but still capable of acting cruelly if driven to do so. So moments like this pepper the text to reinforce this message that Tilly is inherently good. Like from the way that she treats Barney, we can kind of see that she isn't mean-spirited in any way. If she does something cruel, we're led to believe that it's a result of being driven to do so by the people around her. Okay, so on page 176, she says everyone likes to have somebody to hate. So, in the Dressmaker, people hate each other and cause harm to one another because they can't stand the flaws of other townspeople and they don't really have awareness of their own shortcomings. And that's because they're written to be shallow. We're not supposed to sympathize with them. Whereas in the Crucible, the characters actually have depth, but their survival relies on their condemnation of others. So they're very different kind of situations here. Now, Molly criticizes the people of Dungatar, and Tilly says there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So that's a reference to Hamlet, and specifically, Hamlet says that in relation to the country Denmark, because he sees it kind of as a prison, and others call it home. Now, here it's not so much tied to the actual context of where it showed up in Hamlet, but it kind of serves two functions. So it kind of touches on moral and ethical relativism, where we're kind of led to believe that some of the things that Tilly does later on in the text are justified. And it makes sense for it to be set up here because Tilly is about to go all out on these townspeople because there are kind of like two straws that break the camel's back in this text, and one of them is the death of Teddy and the other is the death of Molly. Yet it also shows us that she's still willing to give these people the benefit of the doubt because she's almost defending their behavior when Molly calls it out. Okay, she also says, I pray you do not fall in love with me, for I am falser than vows made in wine, and that's on page 176. So that's a reference to the Shakespeare play As You Like It, and she's kind of hiding her past here. So, in As You Like It, what happens here is there's a character named Rosalind who's dressing up as a man named Ganymede, and she's warning this other girl named Phoebe not to fall in love with her because Phoebe doesn't know that she's actually a girl, and she's just kind of covering her bases here. She also says parting is such sweet sorrow on page 176, so that's a reference to Romeo and Juliet, and it foreshadows that Teddy is going to die at the end of this chapter. So Rosalie Ham is really going in with that Shakespeare here, giving us very good like Brenda Meeks vibes, sitting in Shakespeare in Love.
Shakespeare in Love. Oh!
Anyway, so Teddy shows up in this chapter wearing a new dinner suit while Tilly is in a dressing gown. So earlier on in the text, we see a compromise in their relationship reflected in their clothing, and here we're shown that this compromise is kind of complete, where they're meeting in the middle because we see a switch around of their initial position where Tilly was overdressed and Teddy was underdressed. Now it's reversed. Okay, so Molly calls their relationship sickening, and that's not important. I just really wanted to insert this clip right here.
Sickening, no?
Okay, so their relationship is actually the only one that's built on both emotional and physical intimacy in both texts. Obviously, in the case of the Proctors, we do know that their relationship is built on both, but the physical aspect of their relationship is never thoroughly explored, and it's kind of alluded to that because of Elizabeth's illness, their relationship hasn't had a physical component in a very long time. On page 178, we see the women walk into the ball with their noses aimed at the lights. So again, there's a humorous approach here, and in the Crucible, there's a serious approach. And we also see them kind of adapting to their new roles that they take in their own minds because of the outfit that they're wearing. So the dresses are described in detail to highlight the luxuriousness as well as Tilly's craftsmanship, and they kind of dress to reflect the social standing that they want to be associated with. And we see that when the women of Winyurp ask them who sewed their dresses, and they say that's our secret. So it's almost as if they dress for competition. There's a sense of exclusivity to what they wear or how they want to be perceived. Again, we see lots of colours. This entire section of the book is named after Shantung, which is quite colourful in general. Councillor Pettyman, he says his name like Pedamon because he's so obsessed with other people's view of him that he won't even say his actual name. Now, I guess you could argue that some of the characters in the Crucible, like John Proctor specifically, really care about other people's views of them. But I would argue that these two instances are very different because of the situation that they're in. But I suppose there is a comparison to be made there if you really want to go there. So we see light and dark take on these important roles in terms of good and bad in both texts. So Tilly describes her guilt as a quote-unquote black thing. So in this text, darkness is kind of for guilt or secrets, and we see that reflected in the fact that she arrived in Dungatar under the cover of the night and then left in the light of the day. Now, in the Crucible, light kind of stands for divinity and goodness. So, specifically, John Proctor says that he doesn't see the light of God in Paris, and we see that reflected when Paris is praying in his home, and he's specifically positioned out of the light that streams in from the window. Elizabeth Proctor is also bathed in light at the end of the play to kind of suggest that although her husband doesn't take her advice, she's still happy for him because there's this kind of innate goodness to her, as well as to a lot of the people of the town of Salem, regardless of their individual choices. Regardless of their choices, a lot of those choices were based on their personal perceptions of what is right and wrong. They always act morally. So they might not act ethically, but they always act morally. And the difference is that with morals, they're kind of playing their own game. They're saying, okay, how do I feel about this? Do I personally think this is right? Okay, we also see a kind of difference here emerging in terms of which characters internalize the blame for things that have happened and which characters deflect blame. So whether the characters are self-aware enough to internalize blame rather than deflecting kind of guides where our sympathies should lie in both texts. So Tilly specifically internalizes the blame for the death of Stuart Pettyman. So she says that she carries it around with her, and we're meant to sympathise with Tilly, and quite literally nobody else from Dungatar. And we saw their mob mentality in this chapter, where they kind of blame her for everything and then shut her out of the ball, which literally kind of reflects the way that she is shut out of their community, unless it's convenient for them. But we see the kind of two extremes here in this one chapter in order to kind of juxtapose the two so that it becomes really, really apparent to us just how great the difference is. Now, in the Crucible, we're supposed to sympathise with the Proctors because they do actually internalise blame for what happens. So we see John Proctor internalising blame for cheating with Abigail, as he should, by the way. And we also see Elizabeth Proctor almost internalizing blame for John Proctor's actions, in that she blames herself and she blames her illness for the fact that he cheated on her. Now, there is a kind of parallel here between Tilly and Elizabeth, in that, in some sense, they are victims who almost blame themselves for their own suffering. Okay, so in the Crucible, because the Proctors internalize blame, but Abigail actually deflects blame, where she is to actually blame for witchcraft, or what they thought of as witchcraft, where she actually did commit that sin, but then deflected it onto other people to protect herself. There is some degree of ambiguity with Mary Warren, but she does end up deflecting the blame onto John Proctor when she realizes that the situation isn't favorable for her. So we will talk about Mary Warren a little bit later on when I actually cover the Crucible, but for now let's just leave it at that. Okay, so in chapter 18, Teddy says, "I'll take you to the stars," on page 185, and this really highlights to us that a future for them could only ever really be a dream. And we see that in that the stars are so far out of reach, especially in the 1950s. And this kind of notion of the stars being the last frontier comes from the space race of the Cold War era, which, had just kind of began to ease up in the early 50s. So obviously because of that, we see Teddy die, and the fact that their future could only really ever be a dream is also reflected in the fact that Teddy didn't really have plans for them. He kind of just believed in winging it as they go. So yes, he dies, it's all very sad, and it triggers something in Tilly that we see in the next two sections of the novel. We have now officially reached the end of the second part of the novel, so that is really great. We're more than halfway through. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.